On the evening of May 23rd, 1998, the life of 11-year-old Akiel Chambers changed forever. What began as a simple invitation to a birthday party in Maraval, Trinidad, ended in tragedy and sparked one of the country's most troubling and unresolved murder cases. More than 2 decades later, the death of this schoolboy continues to haunt his family and to raise serious questions about justice, accountability, and the protection of children. Akiel was described by family members as a cheerful boy, attending elementary school and living with his parents in Trinidad. On that Saturday, he was invited to a birthday celebration at the home of Charles James, a businessman who resided in Halidon Park, Maraval. The party was to be a joyous occasion, attended by several children and adults. Akiel's family allowed him to attend, never imagining that it would be the last time they would see him alive. At some point during the party, Akiel disappeared. Witnesses, including other children, later testified that they saw him at various moments during the night, but at a certain stage he could no longer be found. His absence initially caused concern, but what was discovered the next morning shocked everyone present. On the morning of May 24th, Akiel's body was discovered submerged in the swimming pool at the James residence. He was found crouched in the fetal position, dressed in red and white shorts. The pool, which had been the center of fun and play the evening before, had now become the site of a grim discovery. Police were summoned immediately, and what should have been the beginning of a careful and thorough criminal investigation was instead marked by confusion and uncertainty. Officers attended the scene and began gathering accounts from guests, but the clarity of those first hours, crucial to any homicide inquiry, quickly gave way to long-lasting doubt. The first post-mortem examination was carried out on May 25th, 1998, by Dr. Neville Janke. His report noted the condition of the body and raised serious questions. One significant observation was that the anus appeared patulous, widened, suggesting a history of sexual activity. However, despite this, no swabs were taken from the anal canal to test for the presence of spermatozoa, and no samples were preserved for potential forensic analysis. Furthermore, Dr. Janke did not connect this observation to Akiel's immediate cause of death. The report left many unanswered questions, and its omissions would later prove critical. In homicide investigations, especially where sexual assault is suspected, the collection of forensic samples is vital. In this case, such steps were not taken. 3 days later, on May 28th, a second autopsy was conducted by Dr. Hugh von de Vigne. This examination was more extensive, and swabs were collected from the body, along with microscopic tissue samples. For a moment, it seemed as though vital forensic evidence had been secured. But the chain of custody and long-term preservation of these materials proved disastrous. Just 2 years later, in 2000, the samples were destroyed, eliminating the possibility of later testing as technology advanced. The consequence of this decision cannot be overstated. Without those samples, key opportunities to identify perpetrators or confirm suspicions of abuse were permanently lost. In the years following, the circumstances of Akiel's death were formally examined during a coroner's inquest led by Chief Magistrate Sherman McNichols, who acted as coroner in the matter. This process gathered testimony from children who attended the party, parents, and other adults who were present that night. On February 18, 2004, the coroner delivered his conclusion. Akiel did not drown accidentally. This finding was a pivotal moment, shifting the narrative from the possibility of a tragic mishap to the confirmation of a homicide. Yet despite this determination, the inquest was unable to identify a specific suspect, nor could it establish a clear motive. For Akiel's family, these developments brought no closure. They had buried their son, endured years of legal and medical examinations, and yet remained without answers. To them, The failure to secure and preserve evidence and the lack of accountability for investigative lapses represented not just a miscarriage of justice, but an erasure of their son's story. They continued to press for answers, urging authorities to take the case seriously and to treat Akiel's life as worthy of justice. By the end of the inquest in 2004, what was clear was that Akiel Chambers had been murdered. What was not clear, and remains unclear to this day, is by whom, under what circumstances, and why. From this point forward, the case of Akiel Chambers became as much about the failures of investigative procedures as it was about the crime itself. The destruction of evidence, conflicting medical reports, and mishandling of the case would soon draw criticism from oversight bodies and fuel widespread doubt in the justice system's ability to protect its most vulnerable. As the Chambers family mourned their son, the seeds of a larger tragedy were already taking root. The possibility that his killers might never be brought to justice, not because the truth could not be uncovered, but because the trail of evidence had already been lost. By the time the coroner delivered his ruling in 2004, one truth had been established. Akiel Chambers had been murdered. But as investigators looked back at the evidence, or rather, the lack of it, disturbing questions arose about how this case had been handled from the very beginning. Critical samples were lost, official reports disappeared, and key opportunities for justice were destroyed. What emerged was not just the story of a boy's murder, but the story of an investigation that failed him at every turn. This destruction of evidence was not just a procedural mistake, it was a critical failure. With no biological samples available, investigators were stripped of one of the most direct tools available to link a suspect to the crime. Years later, the Police Complaints Authority, known as the PCA, launched an audit into the case. Their findings, released in December 2019, painted a bleak picture. The audit revealed that key documentary evidence, including the post-mortem reports, witness statements, and even police reports from the time, were no longer available. What should have been preserved as part of the criminal record had either been lost or destroyed. The PCA further concluded that the investigation had been mishandled from the outset. According to their review, junior officers conducted poor quality work and senior officers failed to provide adequate supervision. Errors were made in evidence gathering, in the preservation of samples, and in the documentation of witness testimony. These failures compounded over time, creating a situation in which little, if any, reliable material remained for prosecutors to build a case. Perhaps the most disheartening revelation from the PCA audit was that no one would ever be held accountable for these failures. Many of the officers involved in the case had since retired or passed away, placing them beyond the reach of internal disciplinary proceedings. Others were still alive but could not be prosecuted because the PCA found no surviving evidence that proved criminal misconduct on their part. The audit concluded bluntly, while there was strong evidence of mishandling, negligence, and incompetence, there was no remaining proof that any police officer had deliberately committed a crime. Without such proof, no legal action could be taken. The door to accountability was effectively shut. The destruction of physical samples and the disappearance of official documents left the case in limbo. Forensic science has advanced considerably since 1998. Today, DNA testing is far more sensitive and capable of extracting results from minute traces of evidence. But in Akiel's case, those possibilities were lost forever. The tissue samples and swabs that might have identified a suspect were gone. The paperwork that might have guided investigators was missing. Instead, all that remained were fragments, recollections of witnesses, partial reports, and a coroner's determination that Akiel did not drown accidentally. These fragments, however important, were insufficient to build a prosecutable case. In the wake of the PCA audit, the Trinidad and Tobago Police Service established a cold case unit tasked with revisiting unresolved cases like Akiel's. The PCA's audit was formally closed in December 2019, but the cold case team was said to be continuing its investigation. The hope was that, with modern techniques and a fresh review, some avenue might emerge. Yet the reality remained stark. With the most critical evidence gone, the case would depend almost entirely on human testimony. That meant the discovery of new witnesses or the willingness of someone with knowledge of the crime to come forward, perhaps years later. As investigators quietly acknowledged, without such breakthroughs, the chances of solving the case were slim. For the Chambers family, the PCA's findings were devastating. They confirmed what the family had long suspected, that the investigation into their son's death had been botched and that those responsible would never face consequences. They had placed their trust in the justice system, only to find that the very system charged with protecting their child's memory had failed to preserve the tools needed to find his killer. Every revelation brought renewed pain. Each missing report, each destroyed sample felt like another door closing, another chance at justice slipping away. The murder of Akiel Chambers was not just a tragedy of violence against a child. It became a tragedy of institutions, a case where failures of procedure and accountability left a family without answers and a society without justice. And yet, in 2022, the case was thrust back into public attention, not because of new forensic discoveries, but because of shocking allegations linking Akiel's death to powerful figures and hidden networks. Allegations that suggested his murder was not just a crime of opportunity, but a crime connected to something far larger and far darker. As the Chambers family mourned, others began to ask, was Akiel's death the work of a predator acting alone, or was it part of a system of exploitation protected by those in high places? By 2022, more than 2 decades had passed since the murder of 11-year-old Akiel Chambers. The official investigation had gone cold. Critical evidence was gone, and the Police Complaints Authority had closed its audit, concluding that little more could be done. But just as the case seemed destined to fade into obscurity, shocking new claims surfaced. These allegations pointed not just to the murder of a child, but to the possible existence of a wider network and to the involvement of powerful figures in Trinidad and Tobago. In May 2022, Robert Sabga, a respected public figure and former chairman of a government task force on abuse in children's homes, made a statement that reignited the Akiel Chambers case. He claimed publicly that Akiel's murder was not an isolated incident. Instead, he linked the boy's death to a pedophile ring operating in the country. Even more disturbing, Sabga alleged that one of the individuals involved was a person who now held a very high office in Trinidad and Tobago. He did not provide a name, nor did he supply detailed evidence in his public remarks. But the weight of his position and the gravity of his claim ensured that the story spread rapidly. For a nation already scarred by Akiel's unsolved murder, the possibility that such a ring existed and that someone in high office was connected to it was deeply unsettling. The media seized upon Sabga's statements, bringing the case back into headlines. Reports underscored the seriousness of his allegation that a boy's murder, long unsolved, may have been deliberately covered up to protect individuals with influence. The Trinidad and Tobago Express further reported that a high office holder had been linked to Akiel's case, adding fuel to public suspicion and anger. These revelations did not provide new forensic evidence. They did not directly identify a suspect, but they reopened a conversation that had long been dormant, forcing the country to confront questions many had been reluctant to ask. Was Akiel's death part of something larger? Was it covered up to protect powerful interests? And if so, how deep did that cover up go? For Akiel's family, the resurfacing of the case was a double edged sword. On the one hand, any renewed attention brought hope that someone somewhere might come forward with information. On the other hand, the pain of reliving the trauma was immense. Akiel's aunt, Rosemary Seaton, expressed the anguish that these fresh allegations caused. The family had endured nearly a quarter century of grief without closure, and each new revelation reopened wounds. For them, it was not only about speculation or high profile accusations, it was about a boy who had been robbed of his life and parents who had been denied justice. The shockwaves of Sabga's allegations also reached the halls of Parliament. During debates on sex offender legislation, a senator took the opportunity to call for renewed focus on Akiel's case. The senator invoked the boy's name as a reminder of the failures of the past and as a warning about what happens when children are not adequately protected by the justice system. This moment underscored the symbolic weight the case had come to carry. Akiel's death was no longer seen solely as a family's tragedy, but as a national failure, one that demanded institutional reform, not just answers about a single crime. Despite the high profile nature of Sabga's claim, one fact remained unchanged. No names were named publicly, no charges were laid, and no new evidence was presented that could stand up in court. The allegations hung in the public consciousness, powerful but unproven. For investigators, this posed a dilemma. Allegations of this kind are explosive, but without corroborating evidence, they cannot move a case forward. For the public, the idea that someone in a position of power could have been involved in the murder of a child and may have been shielded by their status fed a growing distrust of institutions. Sabga's remarks also connected Akiel's case to a broader issue: the systemic abuse of children in Trinidad and Tobago. His task force in the late 1990s had investigated abuse in children's homes, uncovering widespread mistreatment. By tying Akiel's murder to a pedophile ring, Sabga was suggesting that the boy's death was not just an isolated failure, but part of a much larger pattern of neglect and cover up. This perspective framed Akiel's murder as a symbol of institutional weakness, a failure not only of police procedure, but of a society unwilling or unable to confront the crimes committed against its children. The possibility of high level involvement in the case raised another troubling question. Had potential witnesses remained silent out of fear? If powerful individuals were implicated, the stakes for speaking out would have been enormous. This could explain why, despite years passing and investigations reopening, no one had come forward with decisive testimony. It also highlighted the environment in which the case unfolded, one in which vulnerable victims were exploited and in which those with influence may have been protected. By the middle of 2022, the murder of Akiel Chambers was no longer just a cold case. It had become a litmus test for justice in Trinidad and Tobago. The allegations of high profile involvement, coupled with the family's ongoing anguish and public demands for answers, placed immense pressure on institutions to act. And yet, the stark reality remained. Without evidence, without preserved samples, and without witnesses willing to testify, the case could not move forward in a court of law. What began as the tragic murder of an 11-year-old boy had now become a story about silence, secrecy, and suspicion at the highest levels. The Chambers family had endured decades of grief, but in the court of public opinion, the questions were only growing louder. As investigators revisited the case under the cold case unit, the nation was left to ask, would new allegations finally force action? Or would Akiel's story remain, as it had for so long, an unresolved wound on the conscience of a country? The present reality of this case is not just about what happened in the past, but about what remains undone, and what, if anything, can still be achieved. In December 2019, the Police Complaints Authority brought its audit of the case to a close. Its findings were stark. The evidence chain had been broken. Autopsy samples had been destroyed. Key police reports and witness statements were missing. Many of the officers who had overseen the original investigation had retired or passed away. The PCA acknowledged the investigation had been mishandled, but it also stated clearly that there was no evidence proving criminal misconduct by police officers. Without that proof, no disciplinary or legal action could be taken. For the Chambers family, this represented yet another dead end. Despite the PCA's closure, the Trinidad and Tobago Police Service announced that the matter would be referred to its cold case unit. This specialized team was designed to revisit unsolved cases, using modern tools and fresh perspectives to uncover what had been missed. The hope was that, even without preserved biological samples, investigators might find new avenues. Advances in forensic science can sometimes work with secondary or trace materials, fibers, environmental samples, or overlooked fragments of evidence. But in Akiel's case, the destruction of the most critical autopsy materials severely limited these possibilities. The reality is that a cold case review can only work with what exists, and in this case, much of what should have existed no longer did. Where evidence fails, testimony can sometimes succeed. For Akiel's case, the greatest hope lies in the willingness of someone, somewhere, to come forward with information. Over the years, witnesses who were children at the time of the party have grown into adults. Others who may have remained silent out of fear might now feel freer to speak. The PCA's findings emphasize that without new testimony or a voluntary confession, the chances of resolution were slim. But slim does not mean impossible. Cold cases have been solved decades later on the strength of one witness, one confession, or one overlooked lead. For the Chambers family, each passing year has been a reminder of what was lost. They have lived through repeated waves of public attention: the coroner's inquest in 2004, the PCA audit in 2019, the explosive allegations in 2022. Each time, they are forced to relive the trauma, to answer questions, to explain their grief anew. Akiel's aunt, speaking after the 2022 revelations, described the pain of watching the case resurface in the media without progress. To them, it was not about politics or speculation. It was about a child whose life had been taken and about a justice system that had failed to protect him. The murder of Akiel Chambers is not just an unsolved crime, it is a test of accountability. It reveals how evidence can be lost, how investigations can be mishandled, and how children can fall through the cracks of systems meant to protect them. The case has also become a symbol. In Parliament, his name has been invoked during debates on sex offender legislation, a reminder of why such laws are necessary. For the public, his story has become a marker of distrust, proof, in their eyes, that justice is not always blind, and that the powerful may be shielded while the vulnerable are left unprotected. What would it take to move the case forward? Investigators point to three possible paths: new witness testimony, a direct confession, or the discovery of overlooked evidence that survived despite the destruction of samples. Any of these could revive the case. Attorney Rajiv Persad, representing the Chambers family, has argued that advances in investigative tools could still play a role even decades later. The science of today is far beyond what was available in 1998, but without the core evidence, even the best tools may not be enough. Ultimately, progress depends less on science than on people, on someone willing to speak, on institutions willing to act. For now, the murder of Akiel Chambers remains unsolved. A boy's life was cut short, evidence was mishandled, institutions failed, and a family continues to grieve. But cases like this do not disappear. They live on in memory, in headlines, and in the conscience of a nation. This is the unresolved case of Akiel Chambers, a cold case still open, still painful, and still waiting for the day when silence breaks and the truth is finally known. The case of 11-year-old Akiel Chambers is one of the most haunting in Trinidad and Tobago's history. It raises questions about justice, accountability, and the duty of a society to protect its children. We may never know how different things might have been if evidence had been preserved, if procedures had been followed, and if the truth had been uncovered back in 1998. But what we do know is this: Akiel's story cannot be forgotten. If this case has moved you, share your thoughts in the comments below. What do you believe are the biggest lessons from this tragedy? Do you think the cold case unit will ever find answers? Or does the truth lie only in the memories of those who were there that night? Your voice matters. Discussions like these help keep the pressure alive for accountability and ensure that cases like Akiel's are never erased from public memory. If you want to see more investigations into the region's most important unsolved crimes, subscribe to Caribbean Files. Don't forget to like this video, share it with others, and join us in shining a light on the cases that demand answers. Justice delayed does not have to mean justice denied. Together, by keeping these stories alive, we can make sure that the fight for truth never ends.